Military sexual trauma is an experience, not a diagnosis or a condition, and people react in a variety of ways that has a direct impact on the relationships we have with friends, extended family, intimate partners, and children. MST does not discriminate. People of all genders, ages, sexual orientations, racial and ethnic backgrounds, and branches of service have experienced this trauma. I'm Ashley Rabolja, and I'm a survivor of military sexual trauma. Because this is such a deeply personal issue to me, I've returned to host this special American Legion Tango Lima podcast series. As the American Legion shines a light on veteran suicide, we would be remiss if we did not discuss military sexual trauma, which we know is a pervasive problem with lasting effects on the mental health of survivors' family and community. In this series, be aware, we will be discussing topics that are sensitive and potentially triggering. So take a pause and take a break as needed. Join me as we explore the ramifications of MST, share the stories of resilience, and identify resources and tools for those in need of assistance. Together, we will celebrate triumph and tragedy. Welcome to today's episode of the Tango Lima podcast. In this installment of our series, we have the privilege of hosting two extraordinary guests who have transformed their personal experiences into powerful mission to prevent and support individuals affected by military sexual trauma. Joining us today is Andrea Goldstein. She works as the principal advisor to the Secretary of the Navy on integrated prevention efforts, spearheading initiatives in sexual assault, sexual harassment, and suicide prevention. She is also a Navy Reserve officer. Andrea brings a wealth of knowledge and expertise to our discussion. Our second guest is Dr. Athena Ives, a remarkable individual with an extensive background as a Marine Corps sexual assault prevention specialist, forensic criminologist, published author, MST survivor, and military culture expert. Dr. Ives' unique perspective and comprehensive understanding of MST-related issues and add depth and insight to what we'll be discussing today. Together, Andrea and Athena will shed light on the inspiring journeys and the vital work that they do to combat military sexual trauma. They will explore the strategies, resources, and support systems they have developed to help survivors and prevent future incidences within the military community. Get ready for this enlightening and impactful discussion as we delve into the world of military sexual trauma prevention and support with our distinguished guests. Welcome to the show, ladies. How are we doing today?
It's great to be here.
Glad to be here. Thanks for this opportunity.
Absolutely. We're now diving into the second episode, and I am really excited to continue a really amazing conversation. Our first episode, we spoke to the VA extensively about military sexual trauma prevention, some of the resources and tools that are out there. So some of the first two things I want to get into today are both of you kind of briefly describing your experiences and kind of, just giving me the quick synopsis to how you've gotten into the positions that you currently are and why they're important to you.
So I'm happy to start. So Andrea Goldstein, I'm the acting director for Force Resiliency Department of the Navy. I'm also a proud member of American Legion Post 184 in Hudson, New York. How did I get here? Why is it important? So I left active duty in 2016 with an eye on, there were a lot of issues where I felt like I had really hit my ceiling on my ability to make big change. As a junior officer, mid-grade officer, whatnot, I felt like I was able to make changes within my unit, but at the macro level, really thinking about changing the whole system, there was really only so much that a lieutenant could do. So I left active duty. I went back to graduate school. I used my GI Bill and worked in the veteran nonprofit space, and then on the House Committee on Veterans Affairs as the senior policy advisor for the Women Veterans Task Force, where I helped craft the Deborah Sampson Act. And then after that, I was appointed to my current position at the Department of the Navy. And the work that I've been doing over the last few years have really been about trying to focus on transforming the culture, transforming culture in the military, transforming culture in the veteran space. And on that note, I actually taught a class yesterday about disarmament, demobilization, reintegration, or veteran transition. And when I was Googling pictures of veterans to try to make a point, the search results were much more diverse than they would have been 5 years ago, which was incredible. So here at the Department of the Navy specifically, I've been responsible for implementing more than 200 recommendations and statutory changes to address sexual violence in the military, sexual assault, sexual harassment, suicide, gender-based violence, gender discrimination. But what we do is cultural change, because there are some things that we can do specifically to improve victim care, but prevention is about culture. And having really good, cohesive people, leaders, and teams. And it's important to me because this is the right thing to do. And we are a war-fighting organization. I cannot tell you how many meetings I've been in the last 14 years in any capacity that I've been in, where someone leads it with, well, we're a war-fighting organization, as a reason to dismiss these issues. But we are a war-fighting organization, and we can't be successful in our mission to fight and win our nation's wars, to defend the nation, if we have a fratricide problem. Which is what sexual violence is. So that's why it's important to me on a big level, and from a personal standpoint. I experienced sexual harassment while I was serving. I experienced the system working as designed and that not being good enough. And so I don't want anyone else to ever experience what I did. So that's my reason of being.
As we say, and all of my listeners know, all the things, Andrea, all the things. So that's fantastic. And I'm so glad that the Department of Navy has you as a leading voice. It's amazing just to hear that you've made over 200 plus recommendations and you're actively engaging in those things. So thank you. And I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Ives, Athena.
Thank you. Well, it's such a privilege to be here and to speak with you ladies about such an important but very taboo topic. I like to change something that's horrific into something that's extremely powerful and positive. So when I talk about very difficult things, I always try to say how it empowered me, how I grew from it, and what I'm doing with it today, rather than just, remaining that victim. We didn't have a choice to be a victim, but we do have a choice in how we handle it. And I, grew up, from the moment I was born, I was in an abusive environment. I grew up in a cult, so I had the extreme education of people with belief systems that can be extremely harmful to other individuals, especially women or other people that do not fall under the umbrella of their own beliefs. It put a light on things that most people don't notice. So I use that in my everyday life in analyzing crimes and assaults and different things like that. So I like to dissect the root causes of it. And that was interesting. My computer just went off. But I like to, kind of understand where the root cause is. Because if we don't understand the root cause, we're going to just be reactionary. And instead of being proactive, instead of trying to stop it from actually occurring. After, a very tumultuous childhood that provided me with an education that most people don't have the ability to obtain, I joined the Marine Corps, and during that time I was drugged and sexually assaulted on 2 different occasions, and it it really shed a light on the issues that we were having back then, and the reporting challenges, and like Andrea was saying, the culture, and how that culture made it almost impossible for people to come forward. Not because we couldn't or weren't allowed to, but because of the pressure that a lot of us feel. And I want to add, that's not just the women, that's men too. Men have an unbelievable amount of pressure and different challenges that they face that we don't always recognize. We tend to kind of just see out of one lens that the females are the victims and the men are the offenders, but that is, as we know, is not accurate. And while I was serving, I did see challenges that we face in the culture. And I got out and I pursued my education. I ended up getting a master's in forensics. So I understand the incredible challenge it is to prosecute these crimes. The amount of evidence, the incredible difficulty standing up in a trial and having your entire life analyzed and displayed for everyone to see. So I understood those, which helped me in my work and being an advocate and being a voice for people that haven't been able to, whether that's because they aren't there yet in their healing journey, or they aren't able to because of their job, or they aren't able to because if they do come forward, that could be damaging a relationship that they aren't willing to let go of. So that's my passion, trying to find prevention and that anyone can do. Not on, I would love to get more involved in the big change and kind of what Andrea is doing and on the global scale, but providing leaders with actual things that they can take away and implement into their personal lives, their family lives, and those that they're leading. And that's kind of why I do what I do, so it doesn't happen. It doesn't have to happen to anyone else. Unfortunately, I don't think this will ever go away, but I do believe that we, the people, can come together and make a huge difference.
Well, appreciate you giving us insight in the background, and you're right. The best things that we continue to do are be proactive and preventative, and educate people. And that's why I have brought both of you on here today, because as Andrea said a little bit earlier, right, this cultural transformation, and that's just a huge piece of the pie. And I think you've also stated, cultural change, how long does cultural change last, right? Because, or take, I think is the better question, right? Because cultural change in itself requires a lapse of time, policy, behavioral change. So I would like to discuss a little bit more about both of your insights that you can provide on the cultural transformation, like where we're currently at, where we're going to go. And yeah, you know what? That's fair. I'm really terrible at doing loaded questions. You can ask anybody. 160 plus episodes down, I'm like, brevity.
So I consider myself an incrementalist. Having the vision of where you should go and understanding what the big change is, but what actually gets culture to change is doing a little bit at a time so people get used to it. My personal view is that I don't think so the 200 recommendations I mentioned are from 2 independent review commissions, one of which was ordered by Secretary of Defense Austin, the Independent Review Commission on Sexual Assault in the Military, and the other was required by Congress, the Independent Review Commission on Suicide Prevention and Response. And the number one recommendation, it's recommendation 1.1 of the IRC on sexual assault is that there need to be trained independent prosecutors to prosecute sexual assault outside of the chain of command. That has been something that has been discussed by advocates and Congress for more than a decade. but it was seen as the nuclear option. Now, again, my personal view, the nuclear option actually would be the Department of Justice prosecuting these crimes. It would be taking them completely outside of the military. But it was seen as that. The culture regarding the idea of commanders enforcing the uniform code of military justice in order to maintain good order and discipline within their units, it's just very strong. And the paradigm shift did take 10 years because there needed to be, I mean, every single year there were both policy and statutory change. And by policy, I mean that's a change that's made by the agency themselves without a mandate that's in law, or statutory changes, which means the law compels us to do it. And there were changes that were happening all the time, and there were some changes that were really positive. And you know, some of us may actually remember when the restricted report option didn't even exist. I joined the Navy in 2009, so that option was coming online at that time. We're all old enough to remember when Don't Ask, Don't Tell was enacted, and the amount of sexual violence that members of the LGBTQ community experienced that was absolutely enabled by that policy, particularly lesbian and bisexual women who were basically told, you know, sleep with me to prove that you're not gay. And we're just starting to get the data on the DoD side. We certainly have it on the VA side that shows that members of the LGBTQ plus community of all genders are at higher risk for experiencing sexual violence. And that mirrors society, but again, we're in this closed system where, on that point of culture, we also create and perpetuate our own culture. Boot camp, the service academies, ROTC plebe summer, officer candidate school, our initial training, all of these are places that are closed environments where culture is inculcated, enforced, and reproduced. And so there are a couple of things going on where, you know, we needed to get used to the fact that we made all of these policy changes, and some of them worked and some of them didn't, so that finally when we got to that point of, no, we're going to create an office of the Special Child Counsel, and we're taking this outside of the chain of command, that it was finally at the point where leaders were like, I am not an expert. I'm not an expert in criminal justice. I'm not an expert in trauma response. And finally they were there. And we got to the point where people in the advocacy space kind of knew where we need to go all along. But so that also means you have an organization of 3 million people where there's buy-in. And also at the same time, we also have the power when it comes to cultural change of creating our own culture. So that is one place that we also have to continue to be persistent in recognizing that we can't throw up our hands and say, well, the military mirrors society. Yeah, that's true. That's 100% true. But we are also in many ways a closed system. And that gives us the power to also transform the culture in any way we see fit. It takes will and it takes persistence.
That's fascinating. I don't think a lot of folks would use like a closed system, or they would look at it in such a depth way, right? A very superficial way. We are a mirroring of society, right? It's the same thing when we look at you know, recruitment, attrition, and different efforts that are going on separately in the military at this time, right? Like how we bring more qualified people in, right? And if we're this 1% and then we're these micro segments within a 1% over generations of time, the global war on terrorism vets, us as a 20-year span, that is drastically different than that of our previous era service members. So this is profound, right? So we're moving in, like, I guess maybe 10-year increments, respectfully, between policy to catch up, cultural change to happen. But with those closed systems, I'd be interested to hear your perspective on this, Athena, regarding closed systems and your experiences with forensics and just your background in general, how that applies.
May I say one more thing on the closed system?
Sure.
Which is that there's no question that's what taking place outside of the military impacts the experience of those serving in the military and their families. The point of the closed system is that we have the power to address that and mitigate it in a manner that is not possible outside of this kind of environment.
Oh, absolutely. I agree with what Andrea just said, because what we're seeing from the research is a lot of people that the military have more resources available to them. They have more, especially with the justice system and how the UCMJ works compared to the civilian sector. We're seeing, more ability for leadership to come in and get any kind of justice or stuff that we won't see in the civilian sector. Now, that isn't kind of where I do my best to implement changes however I can. So at this level that I'm at right now, I'm not quite there yet. I would like to get there one day and be able to make more change and impact kind of the bigger picture. But for right now, what I try to focus on is taking all of the knowledge that I have, taking the understanding of the research that we have that's already there, but also all of the lived experiences that people have shared with me. So after I published my book, I had a lot of men come forward and completely tell me everything that they had gone through. The stories that I have heard were very enlightening, and it helped me understand that women aren't the only ones going through this. So what are the problems that we're facing? A lot of individuals that are coming into the military have a traumatic past. They are coming from a family that was abusive or a neighborhood that they were trying to survive. They needed to find a family. They needed to get out of the area that they were. And so we are recruiting a lot of individuals that are broken, and they're getting to boot camp or basic training, and they're not getting the things that they need to cope with the trauma or heal from the trauma. They're instead kind of numbing it. They're burying it. And our instructors aren't quite equipped. They aren't receiving the tools that they need to understand these kids coming in. The other thing that we're seeing is the re-victimization. This research out there shows that the likelihood of you being a victim again makes you more vulnerable. So if you were abused as a child, it's likely that you're going to be abused as an adult. That doesn't mean that it's going to, and that gives the military such an incredible opportunity to step in and get those individuals the help that they need before they become more vulnerable and become a victim, or before they become more vulnerable and become an offender. Because we do see that too, where they don't deal with that traumatic past. They were brought up in a family or an environment or in a culture that had these beliefs of this, you're less than me, or I can get what I want from you, and there's nothing wrong because that's what I deserve. And they grow up seeing these things, and if it's not dealt with, it can increase in an environment. And when leadership doesn't step in and see that their environment is becoming toxic, it kind of gets away from them. And that's where we see the harassment start, which then increases, and then we see the abuse start. But we also see it is there are things especially with gender roles, and having those individuals labeled and put into these boxes that they don't fit in. That's when we see these problems increase. And that's not just for women and becoming victims. That's for men with suicide. That's that belief system where I have to save face. I can't show my emotion. This is what I have to do. I have to be the provider. I have to be the protector. And when they don't fit that role, they're more of the nurturer, or they're more of this, or the female's more of the provider, the female's more of the protector. And when they aren't in those roles, that's where we see those problems. And so to approach it from a standpoint of not equal wages, equal pay, equal this, equal that. More so showing, because unfortunately, we have the majority of people in the service are men. So I always like to take the Ruth Bader Ginsburg perspective that how she went about things and was trying to enlighten those that are the target audience, the decision makers, the people that can implement change, and show them how it's negatively impacting them. And that's what we also see with extremist beliefs, showing them and a living, active difference from what their core beliefs are. And that's where we have the most effective measures of changing those internal beliefs and those core values. And it's not telling someone what to do, because we can evaluate a training, or we can evaluate how somebody did on a test, but how are we evaluating did their attitude change? And that's something that we have been working with a lot of other professionals. So looking forward to seeing that.
So I have a few initial thoughts. I know, especially in the military community, there's research out there regarding folks that are at a higher risk or higher stratification of being put in vulnerable and precarious situations that would lead to either sexual assault, harassment, etc. But oftentimes we're, as a community, labeled as like broken or beyond repair, right? And how do we combat that belief system outside of the military bubble, right? As all service members, right, or veterans, we're like, oh no, we're good. And then the community comes back and there's this stigma that's applied to us. What would be, the advice with some research to show people that, we need to break away from that stigma of we're broken, and yes, we're going to move forward with our cultural beliefs and changes on a macro level, but also the micro level? And let me know if that question's not clear, because I'm thinking about the research, our belief systems, and how we perpetuate a culture of victim mentality, and how the public sees our community, and how do either of you believe we can change that perspective with data, with policy, or anything that would apply?
I mean, there's just no evidence that supports that veterans and members of the military community are writ large broken. There's just no evidence that supports that. There is plenty of evidence that, points to rates of experiences, but that doesn't necessarily mean that, I mean, if every single person who experienced sexual trauma was broken, like, we would just fall apart as a society, because it is so common. I don't know any woman who has not experienced some kind of sexual violence. And frankly, I know very few men who have not experienced some kind of, at least a minimum of, masculinity shaming, which is a form of sexual harassment. So, I mean, it's just, I completely refute the idea that veterans are broken. But part of that is also, the reason my office is the Office of Forced Resiliency is because we expect to experience hardship. We want to mitigate the possibility of interpersonal and self-directed harm to the greatest extent practicable. But the intent is also in how can we recover? How can we become stronger? The resources that are available, both through public, the government, through the nonprofit sector, through private resources. The entire purpose is about how do you get to that point of post-traumatic growth. I mean, I speaking personally, I don't know if I would have continued to be in these positions of getting to have extraordinary influence over these issues, because if I hadn't experienced hardship before, because just inspiration, because I just want to fix it and I'm just angry about it. But the other part is that I know I have done hard things. I have experienced awful things, and I know that I got through it and I will get through it. And that's the whole point. And so actually the evidence points to the opposite, in that veterans in general are doing very well. You start to actually see much, it's even better for those who are actively using resources and not doing what we call in the very academic community self-demobilization. And actually one of the biggest challenges is that stigma, because it is incredibly frustrating to have to explain yourself over and over again. I've hired 25 people in my current job. I've hired people in other jobs previously. I know someone who served in the military has not only experienced hardship, but has also been in a position where they were faced with an incredibly challenging situation, whether it was a job or something they experienced, while on deployment or standing on the watch floor, that they'd never seen before, that was incredibly complicated, and they figured it out because they had to. That's amazing.
I agree. I had a moment of you started like describing it, and all of a sudden I felt like I was back in a place. I was like, man, former Sergeant G trying to solve problems with no resources, limited time, can't find enough people, the 11th hour. When your back's against the wall, right? That resiliency factor that kicks in is something incredibly powerful in our community, and it's one of the reasons folks flock to us when we're in transition, right? Because they're like, I want to employ you because, for all of the following value sets. And I love to make this comparison for any Harry Potter fans that are out there. So it's like the sorting hat, right? Like everybody's personality, and we kind of get drawn to certain branches for different reasons, whether we're seeking adventure or we're like, community and family, right? Like whatever you decide, you have this mini family in each of these branches, whether you're a Gryffindor or the Army, right? Or you're the Air Force and you're Hufflepuff, or whatever you want to assign it. I'm not distinguishing that those two are exactly the mirror of those. I could argue, you know what? I could argue that. I'm not gonna go down that. That would be an entirely different podcast episode. But I say these things because the resilience and the value sets of each of these individual branches, and then as the military as the whole, are a powerful testament to the human spirit and what we can endure and what we can accomplish, both through positive community and a deeper understanding of ourselves. And trauma to triumph is something in that post-traumatic growth stage that we're all aspiring to in some way, shape, or form. You don't have to be in the military to have gone through something and then to have grown from it. I think that's being human. And I think it's a beautiful process. A lot of people are too quick to what was the word you used? Demobilize, self-demobilize. What was the academic term for that?
Yes, it's self-demobilization. It's when you use no transition resources and just basically go home.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, noted in my collegial vocabulary. I will add that. Athena, what are your thoughts? What are your thoughts about the culture and the resilience of our military members and some of the resources and trainings that you've had an opportunity to participate in?
One thing I have learned from especially the position I'm in now is people get extremely defensive when we use the word culture, because now we're associating that with what they believe in. If they don't believe in it, they don't want to be associated with it. So they aren't kind of willing to say, yes, this is part of our culture. I also think a lot of people, we bring in the worst of our cultures that we came from. And it's not that the military is embracing all of these values. It's more so we have a very large population of men, and that, then you have the peer pressure that comes in. You might have one bad apple in the group, but it's going to rot the whole barrel. So I've always tried to check myself when I say culture now, because I've really offended a lot of people, and they have opened my eyes to see, you know, maybe this isn't, it's kind of like what you said, where the veterans, military, are equated to being vulnerable if they're assaulted. And I completely disagree. My research has shown that the doctoral, my dissertation that I had, it was on military sexual trauma and how military culture impacts that. And the results show, and other research shows, that the longer you're in, the more resilient you are. The individuals that had been traumatized said that they got through their trauma because of their military, because of their training, because what they learned they can push themselves to the limit and get through. They're not going to have that in the civilian sector. They're equally as vulnerable to go to college and be assaulted, but they aren't going to have those abilities to build that resilience, and that is where the most and most resilient people are not coming from the civilian population, unless they went through severe traumatic experiences and overcame them. It's the military. They're the most resilient people I have ever come in contact with. And I do think that the media and they can kind of over dramatize things. And the other thing we have to realize is that most of the data that is coming out is quantitative. It's not qualitative. So the people that are reporting are actually victims that are coming forward and talking about it. We aren't seeing the other side of the picture. We aren't seeing the people that aren't coming forward and talking about their traumatic experiences. We're getting more data from individuals that are, you know, open to share their experiences. And a lot of people that are very resilient, they don't want to talk about it. They want to move on from it. They grew from it and they're done. Let's talk about change. Let's see what we can do with what we went through instead of dwelling on it, instead of saying, I want this or I want that. Not saying that there's anything wrong with that. Victims need to be taken care of, absolutely. But I don't think the data actually shows the true picture of what is going on. And that is a struggle, because not only is it hard to do research in the military because it is such a closed environment for a reason, but to get that better understanding, get out in the field. Go sit and talk to the individuals that are active duty. Go talk to the individuals that are serving them. Go talk to the leaders. It's more about getting out in the field and seeing things, and to implement little changes that will actually share their stories of triumph, share their stories of how you overcame it and moved on. Stop dwelling on the negative and start seeing how incredibly powerful this can be. Another thing I use is when I talk about prevention, I don't always talk about sexual assault prevention. I talk about prevention in general, whether that's suicide, domestic violence, substance abuse, any kind of thing that they're, you know, dealing with, talking about it more from that prevention spectrum, and not just a sexual trauma is a sexual trauma and then a combat trauma is a combat trauma. We've all gone through trauma. So talking about trauma as a whole instead of just sexual assaults over here, and they're vulnerable, they're going to be a victim, they're going to want things, they're going to be broken. Absolutely not. And the research shows that that's not the case either. The other thing that I've seen is the research that is coming out saying that women are more vulnerable for PTSD. Women are more susceptible to have more severe MST. That's because women are more likely to come forward and talk about it. Men aren't. So our data it's not as reliable as we would like it to be. So.
Okay. Andrea, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think it's really important to keep naming men here, and there are a couple, both on all sides of the equation. First of all, one of the pieces of guidance that I've given to my colleagues and my team members here, and I also talk about this, with my friends, and but when we're talking about sexual violence, we tend to speak in the passive voice, and we need to speak in the active voice. if someone was sexually assaulted, there is someone who perpetrated violence. And the data tells us that 95% of perpetrators of sexual violence are men, regardless of who the victim is. 95% of perpetrators of sexual violence are men. The other 5% is a group, unknown assailant, and maybe 1% women. So we have to name gender in the perpetration of violence. Second, for men who are victims of sexual violence, there are many who don't necessarily realize that what they experienced was a sexual assault or sexual harassment. They know they were humiliated. They know they had a degrading experience, but they may have, and men are more likely to be sexually assaulted by other men in a group during working hours. And it typically looks like hate, and it's often labeled as a hazing or bullying incident. I don't know what our data would look like if we really looked into hazing and bullying and looked to see if there was sexualized violence, masculinity shaming, all of which are gender-based violence that are being perpetrated against men. And I am actually sure that there are probably some listeners when I'm saying that who might be saying, oh my goodness, as you are listening to this, oh my goodness, what I experienced was a form of sexual violence. VA very specifically, I mean, for years there were more, because there are more men in the military, more men who had experienced military sexual trauma who were using VA resources, and there were women. Now that's changed in the last few years, but we have to keep naming men. Men also have different coping mechanisms. So women are much more comfortable help seeking. That is some of which is just acculturated. But once you start looking at, well, what do your relationship issues look like? Are you having challenges in your relationships? Or you're taking out some of your pain in your family? How are you coping? Because men are more likely to have unhealthy coping mechanisms like alcohol misuse, substance misuse. So once you start to pull that apart, some of the gender imbalances start to even out. It's just that the perpetration of violence looks different, the experience of violence looks different, and the coping mechanisms look different. But that doesn't necessarily mean that coping isn't happening and that violence isn't happening. It is.
I'm ferociously taking notes. I'm trying to keep up with all of these pearls of wisdom and then go back to them at a later point and do my own research and continue to do research. But I'm really glad that we've discussed why it's so important, particularly for men as well as women, right? Because I've had conversations with folks with no connection to the military who make a lot of assumptions. So we know that there's still work to be done in communicating this to our civilian counterparts, our folks who've never or have never had any sort of touch point to the military. So just kind of in final parting words, like what message would you give to the service member, the veteran, right? And folks that have never been touched by the military community regarding what they need to know about military sexual trauma and how they can be an advocate and an ally?
I guess I can start this time. I'll end it. It's not as prevention can be very confusing, but it can also be extremely simple. It can be something as little as showing a video of a female that is doing something that most people think that she can't do. It's showcasing a man that raised his child all by himself. It's countering the narrative. It's presenting ideas or people or stories that are going to start slowly planting those seeds of change in those young minds, which will then grow into leaders. it's not as bad as what people are showcasing it to be. The media loves to feed on the negative and portray it as something that it's not, and showing that we are strong and that we can overcome and even become stronger because of it, and also to approach it from a standpoint to the target audience. We have been so victim-centered. I think a lot of the individuals they hear the word victim and they do not want to associate it with that at all. So coming from a standpoint of you're a leader, you care for your individuals that you're taking care of, and it's not so much approaching it as if you were sexually assaulted, here's how to go get help. It's about investing in that person. That's a human being. It's not just a case waiting to happen. How do we take care of our people? How do we start to slowly change those belief systems that feed into all of the negatives that we're seeing with suicide, with domestic violence, with sexual assault? And how do we slowly start to lead by example and change those things? It's not as complicated as people think it is. It can be very simple. And to also remember that you're always being observed. And sometimes it can be, it can be unnerving, but at the same time, it's an incredible opportunity for you to kind of, to get vulnerable and to show that you're a human being too. And because if you do that, it will show them that they can be a human being too, can get the help that they need to become the individual that they were meant to be, instead of somebody that they aren't. And in closing, I would just like to say, don't let your fear or your trauma control you. It's the monster under your bed. And if you let that monster under your bed control you going to the bathroom at night, it's going to take away the life that you deserve. So you have to get down and you have to fight it. You have to deal with it. You can't keep numbing it over. You can't keep turning off the lights and ignoring that it's there. And one day you'll get down, your feet will hit the floor, and that monster is going to be like, oh man, they're up. And now you have control of it. And it made you more powerful. It made you stronger than you could have ever been before it.
I need you to write a morning mantra that I can listen to. My resilience tape by Dr. Ives. I'll listen to it. I'll be like, Google, cue it up. Let's go. That's fantastic. That's great advice. Andrea, what about you?
I really can't follow the monster under the bed because that's such a good analogy.
It's good.
I mean, but I'll share a couple of things. Something that the Secretary of the Navy has certainly said, and I agree with, is we expect leaders to lead, and who's a leader? Which is you. It's everyone. We're leaders in our communities. We're leaders wherever we are. We're leaders in our homes to, our children who look up to us, to nieces and nephews, and so we can set the tone that can transform the culture wherever we are, and that is part of prevention. And I'll share a very specific example because I'm a reserve officer. I'm the executive officer of my unit, and whenever I talk about sexual assault in the military, whether it's talking about in April when we had Sexual Assault Awareness and Prevention Month, or whenever we're doing the training, the very first thing I do is I get up. I say, every single person in this room has been impacted by sexual violence. And I also tell people, I'm like, just take your bathroom breaks, because I also, whenever you want to, because I also know some people are going to want to get out, want to take a step out. That's okay. So one is creating that culture of safety and vulnerability. The second is I also say, and if you are about to ask me questions about false reports, you can ask me offline. Do not bring those up in front of other people, because all that's going to do is create an environment where people feel like they're not going to be believed when they want to speak up and say something happened to them. Oh, and by the way, false reports are so statistically insignificant that I can't tell you that they don't exist, but they almost don't. Less than 1%. So and those are the kinds of conversations that we can have in any environment that we're in, where we simultaneously create an environment of care and safety, And we also highlight that unacceptable behavior that reduces safety for others, including psychological safety, will not be tolerated.
That is sage advice. Sage advice indeed. Oh, and I have to close this out now? Oh my goodness. All right. So, wow. All right. I'm just gonna. Are there any additional resources or places, websites, programs, things that either of you would recommend to the audience regards to prevention or just in general resources that you find helpful regarding resiliency training?
I think that there will always be a fear of confidentiality in the military. I know that people have trust issues, and that stems from their childhood, which is often enforced in their, active duty status. But there are people out there that do care about you, and you can have a confidential conversation. There are personnel, all you have to do is ask leadership, hey, who could I talk to? And they will send you to the right person. And it will be confidential, and they will get you the help that you need. And there is no shame in getting the help, because in actuality, it's giving you the tools you need to become stronger. So you are a warrior, and you need to sew up your wounds, you need to sharpen your blade, and you need to fix your armor. And that is how you do it.
I think that's a great way to close. I got nothing.
I got nothing. I got nothing, ladies. That's it. Show's over. Well, I just want to say thank you so very much for both of you being a part of this series. I know that those that are listening are going to expand the lens, the paradigm that is military sexual trauma. So I really appreciate you all taking the time to have this conversation today. And we will have links to the resources we've discussed in our show notes. And if there are any other resources, of course, we can talk offline, and we'll make sure to get those things as we wrap up. But I just want to say in parting, Alphas, you can find the rest of this special series and all 4 of our seasons of the Tango Alpha Lima podcast on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, or wherever you consume podcasts. Subscribe to your favorite platform so you don't miss a single episode, particularly maybe this one, just saying, it might be this one. But you can go ahead and also subscribe to our weekly newsletter, and also send us feedback at legion.org/Tango Alpha Lima. So I just want to say thank you for joining us today. This wonderful episode and expanding the paradigm in MST. So thank you both.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Tango Alpha Lima special series. We understand that this content can be triggering. Please know that you are not alone, and if you are in crisis or in need of support, you don't have to be enrolled in VA to connect to the Veterans Crisis Line. Dial 988, then press 1 for 24/7 confidential crisis support.